So I'll make a start, and people can always watch the recording later if it's of interest to them. So this session's all about the use of QR codes to augment experiences. So when we talk about augmentation, it's about kind of, you might think of it in terms of putting like another lens on reality in some kind of way. And I found personally that one of the best ways of doing this is, or the easiest and most accessible ways of doing this is using QR codes. So I'll talk to you a little bit about QR codes, what QR codes are, and how they're used in, or how they can be used potentially in teaching and learning. So next slide. So in terms of the contents of the session, first of all, we're just going to have a quick talk about augmentation in general and how that might help us to collapse the boundary between the virtual and the real worlds, and the value of QR codes or quick response codes in doing that. We'll have a talk about QR codes and how they're used in live material and also in pre-recorded material as well. And then the second half of this presentation is going to get a little bit more out there, quite literally and figuratively, because we're going to be talking about the potential application of QR codes in real environments and how we can actually use augmentation, not only in terms of digital augmentation, but also augmentation in the lived real world as well. And in my view, you know, when we finally do get through this pandemic, there's going to be a huge appetite for things which really are experiential because of obviously the sort of limited nature of the experiences that we've all been having. And so in the final part of the presentation today, I'll be showing you some ideas about how QR codes can be used in the public domain as well. And then finally, we'll be looking at GDPR, data protection, the kind of boring stuff, but I think is quite critical here because this is quite a you know, it's not a new form of technology with QR codes as such. We'll talk a little bit about the history in a moment of that. But I think in terms of their use, there is certainly scope for potential abuse of these sorts of tools as well. Like with anything, you know, any kind of tool or weapon can be used in the wrong sort of way. So we will finish off with a brief discussion about that as well. Okay, so that's the sort of menu, so to speak. But first of all, just starting off with some basic facts, matters of interest about QR codes in general. So first of all, you may not know, but barcodes are actually kind of like the grandfather of QR codes, and or grandmother, and they came about in the 1970s, actually to stop shopkeepers from getting RSI in Japan. They noticed that shopkeepers who were using point of sale and having to type in the numbers were starting to get repetitive strain injuries and carpal tunnel syndrome. So they wanted to develop a system where they could use a scanner, and the barcode was therefore invented. So there's a little bit of geeky background knowledge for you in case it's of interest. So quick response codes, or QR codes, were developed in 1994 as a response from industry to try to ensure that the barcode didn't just contain, I don't know, 17 characters, but could actually have a lot more content embedded within it. And the QR codes that you see out in society today are capable of containing around about 3 kilobytes of information, which for those of you who are kind of interested in kilobytes and things is a lot more than what a barcode could hold, and I'll show you why that is in just a minute. Now, because of the pandemic, we've seen a huge growth in the use and application of QR codes in society. Obviously, we've used it for test and trace, not just in this country, but in other countries as well. And pubs and restaurants are using QR codes much more prolifically than they have done in the past to encourage people to order from their table using the QR code. So they're becoming increasingly commonplace in society. And I will say that 84% of adults have a smartphone that's capable of reading a QR code. So in terms of the question of inclusivity, which I think is a really good question, it's looking like more people are able to have access to this form of technology. And in my experience, our students, it's almost second nature to them. They see a QR code and they seem to have scanned it before they've even seen it. So I think when we're talking about our young people today, we're certainly going to see more people who are digital natives who are able to understand these QR codes and what they are for, and also their creative uses as well, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Also to note that QR codes are used quite extensively around the world, especially in Eastern cultures. China, for instance, I was in China in 2019, and everything is QR coded. Every product you can buy has a QR code on it, and not just as a product code, as a barcode, but actually as, for example, a postcard that sings or has music attached to it. So that's augmentation. It's a way of kind of taking a physical object or a digital object and having a kind of invisible partner to it. And so like a postcard with a QR code that sings is an example of augmentation. And in China, they use QR codes to pay for things as well. So instead of contactless systems, that you pay for things via an app called WeChat, which is their equivalent to WhatsApp in China, and QR codes are the method that they use there. So they are much more prolific in other societies anyway. But what we've seen from COVID is this rapid development of the and proliferation of the use of QR codes in society. Also to mention that Apple and Android now in their operating systems on smartphones have QR code readers built into the camera app itself. So you don't have to download a separate app to read a QR. You just literally get your camera and point it at the QR code, and your camera will detect that there is a QR code there. We might have an opportunity to demonstrate that in a moment, hopefully, but there aren't very many attendees today. So fingers crossed, you might have a smartphone with you, Siobhan, Heather or Andy, and you might be able to kind of test out the use of a QR code, and we'll just see whether that will work or not. QR codes have also been successfully used in education, so this isn't, by any means the first time that QR codes have been used in education. They're particularly popular in secondary and further education, for obvious reasons, that in primary schools you don't tend to have children walking around with mobile phones for safeguarding reasons, but in further education and secondary, they've already become pretty dependent on them. And so it's about how we can use those as a teaching tool rather than just banning them outright. So here's a little bit of geeky background about QR codes. A barcode, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a linear from left to right, and it contains binary code, which is how data is kind of stored through ones and zeros. And that code translates to a set of numbers and letters, and that can be used for product codes. It can be used on books for ISBN codes and so on. And so you'll see them throughout, everywhere. And you go to the supermarket, you'll see barcodes. But in 1994, Denso Wave Corporation introduced a QR code, which isn't just a single axis code, it's two axes. So you think about the encoded data across both from left to right, but also up top to bottom. Just a bit of geeky data. And these bits here on the QR code, the sort of big symbols in the corners, are used for positioning so that the computer knows which way to read the code. You'll notice this particular code as well looks a bit different to the normal QR codes you might see. It's exactly the same technology, but it's kind of branded. And I've just branded it with a picture of a ballet dancer there. And I've done that for a very particular reason, which hopefully will become apparent as we go forward. Not so much the ballet dancer themselves, but actually just the idea of branding the QR code and having it in some way stamped, perhaps with a university logo or something like that. So we'll talk a little bit about why it might be important to have that kind of signature or brand on a QR code so that you can, that it has legitimacy to it. So just to give you a basic example about how QR codes could be used, you may well have been delivering many online presentations recently. Perhaps you've been doing them live, perhaps you've been doing them pre-recorded. And you may well be often wanting to refer students to particular content, what I would call like sideways content. So right now, for example, I'd like to refer you to a website. And the way I'm going to do that is by not only putting the website on the screen, but also by putting a QR code on the screen as well. Now, if you have a camera phone with you, could you just see what happens, whether you can scan that QR code and see where it takes you? Siobhan's just walked into the to the mud wall there. It's really... So if you, I don't know if you've scanned QR codes before. As I say, our students seem to be quite familiar with it, but it should take you to that website, flowcode.com.
Yep.
Yep. So Andy's there. It might, some phones, if you haven't updated the operating system, if it's Android or Apple, it might not automatically do it. But for our students, they tend to have phones which just automatically see the code. So Siobhan, you're there. And if for example, for you, Heather, that's an example of a non-inclusive approach, because Heather now feels like she's not
my
able
Huawei won't do that.
Okay, so ironically, the Huawei phone from China there won't scan the code, which is fine. There are apps you can download which would enable you to scan the code, but most of our young students today, I need to be careful about talking about age and digital competency, because I don't think there are correlates as such. But if you just go to the website flowcode.com, you'll have a look at how I actually generate a QR code. It's pretty simple. I've actually signed up to flowcode.com. It's a free account. And I just literally type in the website that I want the QR code to link to in there. I can choose different styles and it will generate a code for me quite quickly. And I use these quite a lot in my presentations for students. So if I ever want to link to a PDF or a video or a YouTube site or anything, I can just quickly generate a QR code to quick reference the student to that particular link on the slide there.
Interesting.
Okay, so if you think about, oh, I've put the link in the chat, you know, when you say, oh, I've put the link in the chat, the QR code actually is a way of augmenting the student to that resource sort of sideways without having to kind of refer to it. They automatically, so my students now are quite automatic. If they see a QR, they know that Alex just wants them to scan it quickly and it gives them a bit of sideways information. Okay. The other thing to mention is that these codes that I've made here, so the ones which I've used although they say untitled, I've used these in presentations, and these are dynamic QR codes, which simply means that if I want to change the link to one of them, I can. So this is particularly relevant for what I'm about to show you later on in the presentation, because there's some more innovative ways of using QR codes. But just to note that once you've generated a QR code, so I could click create code and put in a website into there. I could also put in icons in the middle and color code it and things like that as well, you'll notice. And I could put my own logo in there as well. It's all free, this. And once I've generated that, I can actually I can later on change the destination that particular code links to. And hopefully, as we go through the presentation today, that will become relevant to why you might want to have a dynamic QR code instead of a fixed QR code. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If it's not making sense at the moment, it will hopefully make sense as I refer to things in just a minute. So another thing so QR codes can link to resources, a YouTube video, a PDF document, a website, something else that helps the student to get a broader sense of what you're talking about. Another thing that you can do is use QR codes to link to Google Forms. Now, this is a fundamentally different way of using a QR code, because now we're not just giving data, we're now receiving data. And so this is a way, you know, there's applications here for researchers who are perhaps looking at ways of, you know, collating information from society. But also, if you were just teaching, I might say, for example, to ask you to scan this QR code, and that just links to a very simple Google form, which says, so I don't know, I think I've written something like, have you ever used or have you ever generated a QR code before or something like that? And it just says yes, no. So it's a way of gathering data from our student. You can use a QR code to either tell or just show some information, but also to gather feedback from students as well. And what I found, there's an example here about how I use a QR in a Zoom session there. So that was just embedded in the slide, and it meant that the students could quickly get to that Padlet just by simply scanning the QR code. It would take them straight to that Padlet. And so I do that quite a lot in my slides and my presentations. But also another thing that it does is if you're watching it pre-recorded, it means that a student has a sort of cue to know when they need to sort of actively do something. So it's a visual cue or a reminder that actually there's an opportunity for them to get engaged and to become more active in the learning process at that point. And because it's visual, they can scan through the video and find those points quite quickly, which obviously if you're short of time is quite helpful because it gives you a real quick way of checking learning. So hopefully that's helped a little bit in terms of the basic use of QR codes in our slides when we're actually looking at putting QR codes in digital content. Now, I got when I first saw QR codes, I kind of wasn't that enthralled by them, mainly because I was in Heather's situation and my phone didn't automatically read them. So when my phone started automatically reading them, I started to realize there were actually new applications for QR codes. And within a couple of years, everyone's phone, I'm sure, will automatically will read QR codes, or most people's phones will do that automatically. And so I actually developed a way of using QR codes to create a real and virtual gallery. So these paintings here are actually up in St. George's Building, and they were kindly donated by an artist who sadly passed away from Ryde in the Isle of Wight. And we donated them as a community to the university. So they're sort of on show in a gallery within St. George's Building, and it was a way of lightening up and bringing some vibrancy into the building. But I've used these as well to I've augmented them. So I've put the title of the art underneath, but also a QR code. And now these QR codes actually invite the audience to write or draw a response to the art. So not only is the audience now just simply receiving the art as in sort of art theory, they're kind of transforming by looking at the art and having an impact on them. Now they have the opportunity to actually feed back and to provide some reflection about what they think of the art. And I think there's real applications here for actually developing a sort of sense of community around things in the built or lived environment. So this idea of actually gathering people's collective thoughts and feelings it almost is a piece of art in itself. So you end up with this kind of co-reflective response going on. Now, I admittedly implemented this in about November last year, and so it hasn't really been able to take off yet. But the beauty of it is that I've been able to make a virtual version of the gallery as well, so people can access these questions and provide their feedback virtually as well. But I've yet to kind of fully launch this. This is all kind of in its infancy. But I just wanted to talk today about some of the applications and potential ideas that can be unlocked with the use of QR codes and just thinking innovatively and creatively about it. Another option or another kind of possibility is that you might put a QR code in a textbook, a physical textbook. And the reason, obviously with the librarian's permission, if it's in the library, but the reason that you might want to do this is because just like with the art there, you can now generate dialogic or co-reflective responses in the sort of third space. So the student reading the book would scan this code and engage in a dialogue alongside others who are co-reflecting on the text. This, to me, has applications in literature, in psychology, in history, in anything in which co-constructive kind of responses to a text or a piece of work is useful or helpful. And again, it's all about augmenting or collapsing those boundaries. So, we're looking at an increasing ways of kind of not necessarily seeing online learning as totally separate from real life learning, but actually being able to kind of hybridize the two. And I think this is one way of innovating and doing that quite effectively. But you can see that if we all started doing that, we might end up with QR codes everywhere. It would be like a complete QR graffiti world that we lived in. So I think, there's obviously limits and sort of ethical boundaries and parameters that we'd need to set as well with these things. Another option or opportunity that I will be using as course leader for early childhood is to augment our play suite. So we have a play suite where students can go in and find out about the equipment in there. But if I put a QR code on a piece of apparatus or a toy, now the student can scan that. It can bring up more information about that particular piece of equipment and how it works in theory. So why the toy helps children's development, but also give them the option to reflect or even take a little video or picture of them using the toy and uploading that. So that then again, the physical object accumulates digital information around it. It's invisible, but it's there, but it's all built into the environment as a kind of third space. So it's a way of augmenting our reality so that we're actually able to enhance our lived experience and co-reflect about the world around us. So again, quite creative, quite out there, and quite experimental. But I think in theory it should be quite popular. I've already ran the notion past the students who seemed really enthralled and excited by that prospect, because as I said, they tend to be quite au fait or familiar with these kind of technologies anyway. Then moving beyond the walls of the university, I've also run, and I have piloted this, a treasure hunt with QR codes. So this sent in during induction week, which was kind of a tricky thing to do because I wanted to get students to get out there and be safe. But I actually used QR codes to signpost the students around different areas of the city, and they had to find the QR code attached to particular buildings, get the little piece of the little riddle or the little kind of code that I'd embedded in the QR code for just via a Google Doc, and then stitch those together to create an answer to the riddle. They then came back to me with that and they got a prize. And so this was a treasure hunt. It just enabled them to get out and about. It was very similar, if you're familiar with geocaching, it was very much like that, but using QR codes to kind of contain that data and for them to stitch that data together to create the answer to a sort of riddle. Andy, did you have something you wanted to add there or ask? You're mute. Yeah, hi.
Sorry, Alex, I was just trying to get my video back up because I just wanted to show my face because I'm loving this.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. So I've got 3 people here, but hopefully people might watch the recording. Yeah. So yeah, it was good fun. And also the other thing that we could do is things like history tours. I know that the English Literature Department have already mapped out the key areas of focus for the key people of literary history in Portsmouth. And you could have key points like that, not only sharing the information about those literary figures, but also encouraging people to share their own poetry. So you're building a set of stories, you're bringing communities together by using the augmentation of QR codes in the built civic environment.
Alex, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Or you might have an example there about sort of how you put it on objects and permissions to put it on the built environment. And
sure. Yeah, I did that. Right. So that was a really good question, Siobhan, and it might take me on a little bit of a digression. But I used paper. I printed them. So I went on Google Docs. I created different Google Docs. I then created the QR codes from each Google Doc, embedded the code within each one, which sounds complicated, but it really, once you kind of got your head switched on with it, it's not too bad. Printed them out, made them look quite nice, laminated them, and then stuck them with blue tack. And admittedly, this is being recorded, but I didn't ask permission from the local authority. I just stuck them around and then collected them back afterwards. And I hope that was okay. But what I'm about to talk about next is more fixed, permanent versions, which we can have a discussion about, because I think there is a lot of potential here. And we would obviously need to get planning permission and things like that to do that, and have them carefully branded and high quality and so on. But what I was doing with the treasure hunt there was quite ad hoc. I went round on my bike all around Portsmouth, posted them in different key locations, and then went back round and collected them. And sadly, I actually had my bike stolen that day as well, so it wasn't great. But anyway, that's a little sad tale along the side of this. But yeah, you could use it for those kinds of things. And there's an example of a more permanent one. This is actually our house. It's not quite, the camera hasn't got the quite right blue there, by the way, so it's not actually as kind of primary blue colour there, but it's more subtle than that. But we put a butterfly. We've got a nursery setting behind our home here, just incidentally, although early childhood is my subject, we just happened to move to a house where a nursery is next door. And because my wife and I are both early childhood trained, we thought it would be nice to be able to do something for the children as they walk down the drive to the nursery. So we put we painted a butterfly, we treated it all carefully and so on. They put like waterproofing on it and so on. And we're about to install this bit here, which says, "Hello there, as you flutter by, come and be a butterfly." And then there's a QR code. And I had to put about 1,000 layers of PVA glue on just to keep it waterproof. But people will be able to scan that and then share their selfie on there. So it would be an accumulation of selfies of people as butterflies. And again, it's just a way of drawing the community together, creating that community spirit and a feeling of togetherness and connectivity. And we've had lots of lovely feedback from people just passing by saying, this is a lovely thing to have. There's no harm in it. And moving forward with the technology or the sort of means by which we do that, we want to find a sustainable way of using kind of upcycling old wood to put a QR code inside and then use resin, sustainable resin, to actually secure it within there so it becomes much more permanent. And I'll talk to you in a moment about the applications and projects underway with more permanent things within the civic environment in Ryde that we're currently kind of in the pipeline. So this is what I was about to talk about. So on the Isle of Wight, we have a company called Ecology, who are basically, I won't go into describing everything they do because it's a lot, but they're trying to enhance the built environment with ecological. Well, this is one example. They're using totems here, so it's a chance for bees to have a home, wild bees, because obviously this is beetles, this one, but there's also one for bees there. And one of the things that Articology want to do is to measure the impact. They know that the totem itself has a positive impact on ecology because of it gives bees a home, but they want to know what's the impact on people and the civic impact as well. And QR codes is one quick way of doing that, because all you'd need to do is link the QR to a Google form and embed it within the totem, and then you'd have a way of gathering feedback of impact and what people's thoughts and feelings are about it. A little bit like a guest book, but a virtual one that's embedded within the totem itself to measure the civic impact of what they're doing there. And in case you're curious, the things on the right here are tidal pools. So as the tide comes in, the water settles in there and marine life accumulates within those pools, vertipools they're called. And again, if you could create a way of a QR code being completely sea-proof, which I'm sure is feasible, then you enable people to provide their feedback and their stories about those things. So that's in the pipeline, and that's all wrapped up with my current doctoral interest as well, in terms of working with Articology and educational settings in terms of community-based pedagogy. So there's that, and then also making history come to life as well. So we have we live in a Victorian town in Ryde on the Isle of Wight, and there's an awful lot of history that could potentially be lost. And so using QR codes to augment in that way is quite exciting. We have plans to develop history tours, as I briefly touched upon earlier, and they're already doing this for tourists in China, it turns out. But you could actually, create quite nice civic, when you're thinking about the built environment, you could just take one paving slab out, replace it with one like there on the left as a mosaic. It's actually a QR code. It will work. It will take you to a particular link, and you could use that to provide, for example, a video. So if that lady there was to scan that QR code, it might bring up a video of, let's say it was in Ryde, it might bring up a video of some people enacting out a scene from Victorian times about what would have happened on the high street in those days. So you could easily do that via YouTube. It wouldn't take an awful lot of money, and it's a different way of augmentation. You may have seen apps that can see what building you're looking at and project something on, but actually that's really quite new technology, and it's quite difficult to create things like that. But the QR code enables us to just quick link to something, for example, a video, and then bring that particular part of the environment to life as it would have been in history. So there's an example of a reenactment there on the right with somebody clean, it's very sort of typical image that you might have seen, and someone cleaning a rug, and you might kind of take the photo of the thing there. It will then bring up a video, and it would show you that, what life would have been like back in the Victorian times, for example. So again, another quick, easy way of augmenting reality that doesn't rely on, technology outside of the boundaries that the lecturers and tutors have access to within the University of Portsmouth. And then taking that further, we're actually looking at doing that in Ryde for buildings. So the importance of the buildings and the history of the buildings. People of relevance as well. So people who kind of want to share their stories, people who are perhaps, just to try to link the community up and get people talking to each other more. So you might scan a QR code and it might say, did you know this person who's here, and a little bit about their backstory, obviously with their permission, and you'd have data protection questions around that. But it's a way of kind of making people realize who lives in their community as well. And then again, for the environment, if you put a QR code on a bin, for example, and use that as a way to encourage young people, perhaps gamify the collection of rubbish and say, I want you to find 20 pieces of rubbish, because that's the challenge, take a photo of it and upload it here, and you have that on the bin, then it could potentially help to promote the idea of responsibility for our environment and so on. And then the blue and the color coded as well. So red is for buildings, yellow is for people, green is for environment, and then blue is for feedback about the kind of tour in general. So you'd have a sort of branded QR tour around Ryde. It's a little bit like gamifying the whole of Ryde, a whole town, and making it a bit more accessible to tourists as well. And tourism, as you know, on the Isle of Wight is our key input. And then we've also got plans for linking up between Ryde and Portsmouth. We want to create a project called Two Tidal Towns, which is not just between Portsmouth and Ryde, but any coastal towns to link up. And using QR codes, you could think of them almost like portals, because if you had one that linked to a a webcam and another that linked to a webcam that was permanently installed, then you could like link the two through a sort of portal via the QR code. But equally, if you had a QR code on a wall here and it said like person point and it linked to a town in, let's say, Hastings in East Sussex, and then in East Sussex you have something there that said links to Ride on the Isle of Wight, and then the people would scan those two things in their totally different locations and they would suddenly be in a conversation with each other. So it's about linking people up not only locally but also potentially between different towns as well. Now on the Isle of Wight there's a rationale for that, because we like to try to promote the idea of people moving off the island and traveling. There is a kind of, I'm sure I wouldn't be too unpolitically correct to say that there is a culture of wanting to stay on the island. Sometimes people don't always travel as much as they might be able to. They don't really know what's beyond the horizon sometimes. So that's one way of opening up international links and national links as well, just within the country between the coastal towns. And so there's plans afoot there, and that's all what my wife's doing because she runs an art centre in Ryde. So it's all kind of linked up with projects that are underway there. So just to finish off by talking about some of the risks. So we've got to obviously with anything weigh up the risks and the benefits. I'm sure as I've been talking, you may have thought of some of the barriers to all of this. One of them, probably the most important one, is the data leaking. If you think about just linking to a Google Doc out in society, you know, and people uploading to that, you've got to be very clear about how that data will be public then. So with the butterfly one, for example, any selfies that were shared will now be almost public domain data. So it's about really making that clear to whoever's scanning it, especially if we were doing it as an institution. That's just me as a person doing it outside my house, so it's not too much of a worry. But if we were an institution using QR codes, we've got to be a little bit careful about data leaks and data collection and GDPR and so on. So it's about having clear caveats, I suppose, on the QR code document there, whatever it links to, if you're collecting data. Also overuse, you could end up with people not really doing high quality use of QR codes and just like scruffily putting them around, a little bit like what I was guilty of when I did my treasure hunt around Portsmouth. And also finally remembering to use dynamic QR codes so that you can change them, because you don't want dead links out there. And if you've put a QR code in a nice piece of wood and put resin on it or something and permanently installed it somewhere, whether that be on a private business or in a public civic municipal domain, I think it's important to be able to later change that link in case you need to. So it's remember to do a dynamic one, otherwise you might spend £50 or something installing it in a lovely encasement and getting all the planning permission to get it out there, and then having to then redo it because you need to change the actual QR code if it was fixed to a specific link beforehand. I hope that some of that makes sense and why it's important to do dynamic QRs and not fixed ones. The video there, I haven't put a QR code link to it, funnily enough, but that actually links to some stuff in the news recently about people abusing QR codes on letters. They've replaced the QR to the local authority kind of business people or the banks, so that people get a letter in the post and then scan a QR and they think they're going to the bank, but actually they're going to someone else's bank account. So there is already abuse of QR codes. And again, that links back to why it would be important to keep them branded so that you have it clearly kind of signatured that this is the University of Portsmouth one, or this is your particular business or local authority or town council or however you might be interested to use them. So that's it. That's the input part over, and it was just over to you really for discussions and thoughts about potential applications of QR within your teaching or perhaps more creatively within your subject disciplines. And yeah, there's not many of us, so yeah, over to you.
Siobhan, Heather, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll sort of jump in. It's yeah, fantastic. It's really interesting, and I am, because I'm working on research with the university at the moment, and my research is meant to be public engagement with people in 4 different urban common sites, none of which are in Portsmouth and none of which I live in. So at the moment, it's been very difficult to sort of try and think about how I might be able to do that. So I'm trying to sort of think about that in that sort of context of whether I could use something like this as a way maybe to both gather information from people when they're in those sites, but also perhaps as some sort of way we're doing sort of oral history So maybe a way of getting that out to people as some sort of event, as some sort of sharing event. And particularly because one of my interests is to get people out into those spaces and walking in those spaces. So, the idea of a trail, as you had, would be a really interesting sort of a way of encouraging people to go out in that space and find out a bit more about the commons. And so, yeah, but I am trying, I'm already finding it, because it's a very different, I don't work in that sort of virtual world. I work in a performance world, of really thinking through the ethics and, as you say, so if you've got any pointers to where to look for sort of guidance of how to express those caveats and what to say and what to think about, I'd really appreciate that.
Thanks, Siobhan. That's really exciting, and it reminds me of another project. Sorry, so many different projects going on that I need to actually do. But another one was like, imagine campfire stories. When we sit around a campfire and tell stories to each other, we're kind of missing that now, and because of COVID and because of disconnect and divisive society. So if you had a kind of urban campfire and people could scan the QR and then share their stories to it, and then you could scan it and read their stories. It's a way of exchanging our narratives and our stories of our lived experience. So I think there are exciting applications for QRs in terms of the built environment, and certainly in research was something I thought. I'm not particularly research focused myself, but I certainly think there's capacity or value there. And as far as ethics goes, I was just thinking about data protection really, and making it clear to whoever's scanning it, like you would with any questionnaire, that how the data will be used. You don't have to make it visible to everyone. So, if you had a QR code out there, it could just be receiving data and not sharing the output of the data. But you could share it if you wanted to via another QR. So you could have a Google form and then a Google sheet, so that you could see the data that was collected. But obviously you might not want to do that because of confidentiality and privacy and so on. Yeah. Cool.
I think it's really exciting. I can see them being used with our other partners who are companies, supplement companies, testing companies, food companies, as a way of linking students to them and them linking to students. So that would be good. Yeah.
I've just shared a couple of links with you. I've been involved in tourism in this neck of the woods for many years. And the South Downs National Park are really good advocates of QR codes. I've just put a couple of links there just to kind of see the kind of the first one's a bit older, the second one's a little bit more recent, but it's, you go out on a walk and the QR code is on a wayfinder trail. So it works. Yeah. Alex, I was going to ask, one of the last things I played with, and then they stopped running it, but HP Reveal.
Yeah.
Which was like the augmented, that was fun. And I think the closest you've got now on a phone, I think, is Halo AR. Yeah. And
I've used those. Yeah.
Where you can, instead of putting your QR codes, you can just it links to something that's already there.
Yeah.
But it's an AR version, Siobhan, here. It's a slightly different direction.
Yeah. Because
I was looking previously at Zappa, where you might put an image up, a bit like Harry Potter. You put an image up and, that sort of is embedded in the content you're showing, and then the film starts of the content that you've created. So you're saying that there's another one called Halo?
There's one called Halo. I've got it as an app on my iPad Pro. I'm not sure if it's Halo, but it's basically, it's very quickly. You take, so for example, where Alex was showing, if you had a cover of a textbook, if you scan the cover of the textbook, it would add something on top of that, whether it was an image gallery or I don't think it does URL links. It does images to YouTube and other things.
The only caveat to the use of those is that the person looking at them needs to have the app. Yeah. And I think the thing is with the QR code thing is because it's universal, it makes it instantly available. And I think that is a big selling point. But I know I've used those things before, Andy, in terms of like the augmentation. It's looking for the actual image to then superimpose something into the augmented reality, which is really cool. But equally, like if you need to get the person to download the app, then it doesn't challenge. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's the challenge.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think the QR code, we used to do it. I used to have lots of reading lists. when I did the tourism, I used to spend a lot of time doing about 30 or 40 different reading lists. And I never used to get the students. So very simply, we used to put in the library, we used to create an A3 poster and had the reading list and then a QR code. So as the students were walking around the library, oh, where's Andy's reading list? Oh, it's there. Scan, reading list, go and find the stuff. Because it's really easy. It's such an easy concept to use.
It is. And I think, Andy, for me, what happened is I suddenly went, oh my goodness. So basically I put a QR code out there and it makes it like this invisible space that pops up, like a third space. And the moment you realize that, you can start to think of all sorts of applications. And I got a printer recently and I've tested how small I can make them. So I could hide one in a painting and then use it as a sort of the mystery QR code somewhere in the painting that someone has to find. And it takes them to a, some sort of website with a mystery to unravel.
I mean, you're knocking on the door of escape rooms there now, aren't you?
Yeah. Like, that's what we need, an escape room.
I'm thinking now of a nutrition-focused escape room. I like that idea.
Yeah, and get students out and about, get them moving around so they're physically engaged as well. I think that's, Do
you know, we got an escape room for Christmas. I got the family an escape room game called Lopping or whatever it's called, and there's 3 of them in it, and they're remarkably well. The app's really good, but then it's all based on cards. But it's so clever the way they link, and I'm sitting there going, there's a learning and teaching avenue in there somewhere. The way that they print off a card and go and link those 2 together, and it's it would take a bit of doing, but actually the idea of that virtual space. Heather, have you ever seen anything called Janali?
No.
If you want to do a space, you can actually do that with, I'll put the link in. It's a virtual space tool, which I've used quite a bit. It's the challenge at the moment. You can't lock it down unless you buy, there we go. I've got the link.
Buying things not good at the moment.
You can create resources online. It's there. I don't know whether they've used that actually, but it's for virtual field trips. It's great because you can create these. Well, I've done a session on it around using it for field trips. But if you had a lab header or a room, you can take photographs of the room and then put hotspots on it. So it links up, and you can actually embed QR codes in that to link out again.
Yeah, I was talking about something like that with Mike around anthropometrics, teaching anthropometry, which is nobody's ever got a really good resource for it, and sort of having to do our own from scratch, and that would be a really good way to do it. Yeah, sounds interesting.
I've learned something new, the word anthropometrics. I love it.
Oh, there we go. I'm not sure I can spell that.
It's just basically measuring people.
Okay.
That's what it means. The measurement of man.
Yeah,
circumferences, heights, etc., weights.
Yeah.
There's loads of ideas for that. Sorry, you're in good because Alex and I are both quietly geographers. Anyway, is it geography you've got, Alex, or is it environmental science?
Well, I did environmental science as my second.
Oh, there we go. You see.
My background is I don't have any qualifications in those things, actually, Andy. My background, I did my first degree in English literature. My other degree is in psychology. So I've got a BA and a BSc and then an MA, and then I'm doing my doctorate now. So I've got quite broad interest in stuff, but I've never actually got any qualifications in environmental science, but I am interested in it.
And all the play stuff that you do.
I'm just thinking of geography. Coming to geography, there's a really good exercise we could put together, which is about food access and food security, and making an estate with all sorts of limitations like bus stops and the corner shop and the supermarket 2 miles away, and stairs going up and things like that, and sort of
getting what you could do is take a Google snapshot, get your area, put that in as your background image, and then you hotspot on top of that.
Wow.
So you can do that.
Oh, wow.
Heather, if you want a hand with that, give us a shout and I can talk you through it.
Okay. I don't think it'll be something I just tackle just yet because
that's fine. No.
My staff are falling like crazy at the moment with homeschooling and everything. So
when you put it on your wish list, and when you get the time, we're here. That's what we can help you with. So
I love that idea. I think it's really exciting.
I think the sessions like this, Alex, I'm really grateful for you running. And again, I apologise. I'm very grateful to Heather and Siobhan for coming. We will. This has been recorded and we will share it. But
it's sometimes nice as well to have fewer people because we can have a more intimate discussion.
Yes.
So like sometimes if I had no idea how many people, but if you had like 50 or 100, then it sometimes is a little bit, you might get a few people talking in general, but you then worry about the rest of them who are not interested anymore. So it's really nice to have a small group who are really focused. But
I'm also thinking about, because we teach business as part of the practice development, and I'm just thinking about, well, how can graduates and students be using QR codes in their business to generate business? So that's another thing as well. So
that's been huge. Because I'm with my kind of like ex-business hat on, particularly Sean, you were talking about walking, getting businesses to do that, and to have their QR codes if you're on walking routes to link to a cafe or something like that, or it's a very easy, it's a quick win, but it needs to be coordinated and planned, and but yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for I've had a lovely captive audience today, so thank you so much for coming along.
It's lovely to meet everybody. Thank you.
It was great.
Great.
What I mean, I don't know that it does make any difference or not, but I think on the information about it, it said advanced, intermediate, advanced.
It did, yeah.
So, and because I haven't done anything like this before, but I'm looking at ways to, develop the practice I've got to include this because of the circumstances. I thought, what the heck, I'll join. But
exactly, that's what
it might be that whether that put others off, I don't know.
Yeah. I thought, I don't think about this and going
with the adventurous ones.
Yeah.
That's what we need to recall it. Safe, moderate, adventurous.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think
I'm trying to work on a visual at the moment. Just where we're at with this online thing at the moment is that we've come to this analogy, or my analogy, which I'm sharing, and I've shared with some groups nationally, is that it's a bit like a motorway. We've got colleagues in the outside lane that I'm calling the speeders that have got it and they've gone. We've lost them. They're in the distance. We've got colleagues that I call the cruisers. Actually, that's a bad name in hindsight. That are sitting in the middle lane, doing 70 mile an hour, being really consistent, doing what we need them to do. We got colleagues in the slow lane that are like the probation drivers that are still getting used to it and don't have the confidence to necessarily get into the middle or the outside lane just yet. And then the worst one is that we've got colleagues that haven't got in the car.
Oh no, I'm going to add to that, Andy. Stuck on the hard shoulder.
Yeah. And what I'm trying to do is come up with loads of analogies of, right, we need to bring these speeders back. Yeah. Stop at a service station to give everybody else that hasn't started, and to get the people that are still in the car. The speeders have to program their GPS. And it's their voice encouraging them to go on the journey. So it's we just got to be creative. And it's Alex, stuff like this today is absolutely central to that.
This happened to me at Westminster when we first introduced Blackboard, God knows how many hundreds of years ago. Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. And
I think if you saw Ali's this morning, Ali knows that. And I think it's this notion of everybody's got to come on. We've got to do it collectively. It's a bit like the Marines. We can't leave a man behind or anybody behind. We've got to do it collectively. And the challenge is so many people have got it. And when they go off into the distance, it's almost, I don't want to stop people going into the distance and experimenting. But it creates this gap between the expectation, because students who get it go, well, I can't have that all the time.
Yeah, but we get that.
And it's for those people that aren't necessarily as au fait as we'd like, struggle because it puts the pressure on them a bit.
Our narrative at the moment with students is, well, life's like that. It is not all consistent. So that's how we're spinning it.
That's the honest answer, isn't it? Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for the two of you for coming along. We do appreciate it. Alex, fab as always.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you so much.
And I wanted to say, Alex, I absolutely love the butterfly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Where I live, we have some really great murals that artists do on different houses, and they just ask different houses to put them up. But I think that would be such a beautiful idea to sort of add to these murals that we've got around us.
Yeah, some way of feeding back to bringing the community together. They're almost like icons, like hubs that you can actually use to synthesize or synergize communities and get people talking a bit more. So that's what we're doing in Ride. So lots of projects underway.
I'll keep an eye out on the things you're doing, because they're absolutely fascinating.
Oh, thanks, Siobhan. That's really nice feedback. Thank you. Thanks for coming along, both of you.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Heather.
Take care.
Bye. Thanks, Andy. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.